You're listening to the Hello World Podcast number 11. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today's guest vehemently told me that she did not write any code, therefore that you wouldn't be that interested. I have my doubts. I think this is a great story. Mary Jo Foley has covered the tech industry for 30 years for a variety of publications and websites, and is a frequent guest on radio, TV, and podcasts, including this one, speaking about all things Microsoft related. She's an author of Microsoft 2.0, How Microsoft Plans to Stay Relevant in the Post-Gates Era, and her primary blog is allaboutmicrosoft.com on ZDNet. She's also the co-host of Windows Weekly podcast on This Week in Tech. Let's take a listen to how she got started writing about Microsoft. So I'd like to welcome Mary Jo Foley to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Are you buried in snow right now?
Yeah, kind of more like black, slushy, gray snow in New York.
Well, I think that is snow in New York City, right?
It is.
I lived in New York City, or was actually born in New York City, and my only memory of the snow there is that, it immediately turns black purplish.
Yeah. It's not very fun.
No. So no oddly colored snowmen in your future.
No. The worst thing here is the puddles, because the sewage systems here don't drain that well when there's snow like this. So there are puddles. I'm not kidding you. They're like 3 feet wide and 3 inches deep that you're supposed to somehow jump across.
Wow. And I have a vague memory of like the snow going over the puddles, so you don't see it until you think you're walking over some snow.
That's always fun when you suddenly realize, oh, I'm over my boots in water.
Yes.
Dirty.
So let's talk about how you got started. My assumption for, I've been reading you for years, is that you were a neighbor of Bill Gates and have just been stalking him ever since. Is that the correct story?
That's not exactly the correct story.
Oh, okay.
Though I did live in Seattle for 8 years.
Oh, okay.
But I can back into that or go forward, however you want me to.
Well, let's start, where you got started writing. I mean, I assume, because of what you do for a living, that it's a passion of yours.
It is. I actually have a degree in communications. That was my undergraduate degree. And I always wanted to be a writer of some kind ever since I'm not kidding you, ever since I was like 5.
Wow.
I used to tell everybody when they'd say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd always say a writer. I don't know where that came from or how, but yeah. So I did go to college and got my degree in communications. And I wasn't sure when I graduated, what kinds of stuff I'd be writing about, because I really didn't have a specialty. I just was a generalist.
Okay.
And so when I put my resume out there, I was kind of wondering, I wonder who will bite on somebody who doesn't really have a specialty, but who can write. And I ended up getting 2 bites. One of them was from Travel and Leisure magazine, and the other one was from a startup magazine called Electronic Business, which was based in Boston.
Oh, interesting.
And because I was already in Boston, that's where I went to school, I went and interviewed for the electronic business job. And I told them, I don't know anything about technology. I literally know nothing. And they said, don't worry, we'll train you. So that's how I got started. And it was kind of luck.
And so they were more interested in your ability to write than your ability, in their sort of genre.
Yes. And they started me out on a beat covering components. So my first stories that I did for them were about things like capacitors and resistors and copper wire. And I had to write about the supply chain for those and talk to companies like Panasonic and others who were making those parts. So I just kind of came in green and said to them, hey, I don't know anything about this, but here's my assignment. And can you explain to me what's what?
I have to tell you, in the sort of this technology world that I live in, I know that some of the articles I read and are excited about are a little dry, but the supply chain of a capacitor, I cannot imagine that being an exciting, story.
No, it wasn't. And that's why actually after I did a few stories on those topics, I went to my boss at the time and said, I don't mind writing about technology, but can I write about something else?
Sure.
And my boss said, sure. What do you want to write about? And since I was so green, I didn't know. So I went to the library because this was before we had the internet at our fingertips. And I just started looking through annual reports of tech companies. And I saw a few that were interesting. And one that actually caught my eye was Microsoft. And I didn't know anything about them at all. And I came back to my boss and I said, I want to write about software. I just kind of picked it out of a hat.
Wow.
Basically. Yeah. And he said, okay, what do you want to write? And I said, I found out about this little company. Their name is Microsoft. And I think I should write a story about them and who they are and what they're doing. And so he said, okay.
Were they in Seattle already or were they still in Arizona?
They were in Seattle then. And so I literally picked up the phone and called the number on the back of the annual report. I'm not kidding. I know this sounds these days like this just sounds insane. Like how could that even be possible? But
or work. Yeah.
Right. Or how would anybody actually take you seriously? And I just called and they sent me to the PR agency, Wagner Edstrom, who is still Microsoft's PR agency today.
Interesting.
And I got to talk to Pam Edstrom, one of the founders. And I said, hey, I'm a new reporter. I want to write a cover story about Bill Gates and Microsoft. And she said, sure. Why don't you come down to Comdex? He's going to be there and you can interview him.
Wow.
That was 1984.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this is in the early days of them building DOS for PCs, right?
Right. Right. Windows 95 hadn't happened yet at this point, obviously. It was like 10 years away.
Right.
So, yeah, I flew to Comdex and they gave me everybody. They gave me Gates. They gave me a whole bunch of the board members and the president,
wow.
John Shirley. I mean, I interviewed so many people and it was really intimidating because here I am interviewing all these hotshots at this new software company. And I didn't know anything about software pretty much.
Sure. I mean, but you were a user of a computer. You were writing on a word processor, right?
No, barely. When I started doing some work in writing about technology, the very first system I had was a CPM machine that we'd write our stories on notepads like paper.
Yeah.
And then we'd input them into the system by typing them in on the CPM machine.
And so you were doing all your composition still by hand.
Right.
It's just a matter of we need to get it in print. I have to go through this other step.
Yeah. So I didn't know anything. I really did not know anything about DOS. I didn't know about operating systems or tools. I knew what those words were.
Sure.
But all I knew was what I had read. And then they kind of threw me to the lions and said, go interview Bill Gates.
Wow. And how did that interview go? I mean,
it didn't go that well. But I don't blame him in the least. It's like, wow, you just sent like your greenest kid to interview this guy who's basically a genius, right?
Right.
And he was really distracted during my interview and kept kind of fidgeting and looking around and talking to people while I was trying to interview him. And you could tell he just wasn't into it. But
sure.
Because I talked to so many people and I did so much homework for this, the story ended up coming out great. Oh. And my boss loved it so much, he said, okay, you're the software reporter. Boom. That's it.
You've now backed yourself in the corner.
Exactly. But I was glad because, I mean, yeah, well, if your choice is writing about beryllium copper wire or operating systems, I think I got the better end of the stick there.
Absolutely. No more supply chain articles.
Exactly. So I used to write on and off about Microsoft. They weren't my main beat company at that time. I wrote about a lot of other software companies too. I wrote about Oracle. I wrote about Taligent, if you remember them way back in the day.
I vaguely remember them.
I actually interviewed Steve Jobs once for that. Oh. So yeah, I got to interview like some of the who's who in software, which was amazing and very humbling every day that I got to do it. But it was great because it was really fun. Every day I'd go to work like, wow, what am I going to learn today? I don't know, but it's going to be fun. That's
awesome. And did this magazine morph into one that talked more about software? Because it sounds like more of a electronics journal. Mm-hmm.
We kind of did a little of everything. We did a lot of software coverage. We We did hardware, software. We talked a lot back in that time about the mini computer business and kind of who was coming in and going out of that business. I wrote a lot about Unix and Sun Microsystems. So yeah, it was like a whole kind of the whole cast of characters at that point.
Interesting. And did you interview any companies that ended up being a big deal and they seemed like, they were four guys in a shop when you interviewed them?
Let's see. I'm trying to think back. I've interviewed so many different software companies and software execs. It's hard to remember. I mean, the thing to keep in mind about Microsoft was when I interviewed them, they were pretty small.
Yeah.
They were like seen as an up and coming company. But I remember when I went to my boss and said, I want to do a cover story on Bill Gates, he was kind of like, who's that? Like that. Microsoft was not a household name in 1984. They were an up and comer for sure.
Yeah, I think in 1984 they had like 120 employees, if that. Yeah. It's a little larger
they were. I don't quite remember how big or small they were, but I just remember they were not like now. You just assume, oh wow, Microsoft. But in that day, it was like they were just one of many players in that space.
Yeah, no one. I remember in 1984 that I was a wee lad then. That wasn't a company that even occurred to me until probably 86 or 87 when I started using some of their products.
Yep.
For me in that time, I knew Apple, I knew IBM, of course, Commodore, which did its swan song pretty soon, and those were the sort of software companies. I tried to learn and tried to figure out where a lot of this stuff came from, and the stories about paper tape, basic compilers, and all that were interesting. But I didn't have much context when I was
right. Yeah, I mean, I the part to me that was really fun about it was both learning about what is an operating system, but more, there was like a lot of drama at that time. Now we have Microsoft versus Apple and Microsoft versus Google, but back then it was Microsoft versus Novell. It was OS2 versus Windows. It was CP/M versus DOS and DR-DOS. And there were still a lot of battle kind of stories and drama stories that made it really fun just in terms of trying to keep up with who was doing what.
Yeah, so you were sort of in the middle, or at least reported on the whole MS-DOS versus DR-DOS story, because this is one that always sort of fascinated me because we called them operating systems, but they seemed so much smaller than what we think about as operating systems today.
Very much so. But at that time, it just seemed like and the other big one was that I remember covering that now sounds funny, was when Microsoft started building Windows NT, and everyone's like, oh, they are never going to compete with Unix. That is a joke, right? And they were such the underdog, and people were like, this is going to fail. This is just stupid that they're even trying to take on Unix. So in hindsight, it's like, all these things look like little weird battles, but look at them now.
Yeah, my memory of it back then was that why would Microsoft even try to get into the enterprise space that Unix owns? They'll never be a big player there. IBM and Sun, and they own that. Why? How could they ever compete there? Whereas that's all people think about. They're like, oh, Microsoft owns the enterprise. Why are they going into the consumer space? It's history repeating itself, as it were.
It's so true. I mean, now it just sounds weird, right? That was even like Microsoft wasn't always an enterprise company. When I first started covering them, they were a tools company. Yeah. I mean, they made tools, developer tools, and when they started getting into the enterprise with Windows NT and then SQL Server in a concerted way, people considered them a joke. And I remember writing so many stories with talking to IT professionals going, these guys are a toy. This is not even software. I don't even know why they're bothering. And now if you think about that, everybody's criticism of Microsoft is they're too enterprise focused and they're not consumer enough.
Yeah, it's interesting. So has the focus always been, pretty much Microsoft since then? I mean, I know that, you're known as the Microsoft reporter, the one that, at the Microsoft event, it's still, you can talk about this as long as you don't talk about it with Mary Jo.
Aw. I guess that's good, but not good in another way.
Well, sure. I mean, but it certainly shows that your reputation of, you're well known as the person that if it's almost like you're not allowed to talk to her about this, but if you are, at least you know who you're supposed to talk to about it. Yeah,
exactly. The part I always tell people is I've outlasted pretty much everybody, right? Yeah. I mean, it's great that I still get to do my job and I still find it fun and enjoyable. But I've outlasted so many of the Microsoft execs. I've outlasted a lot of the other people who started on the Microsoft beat at the same time I did. And now there's a whole bunch of new Microsoft reporters, many of whom are very good too, Yeah. So you always have to stay on your toes and you can't get complacent and you can't say, well, I really know Windows, so I really know Microsoft. I mean, look at all the parts of the company you have to know these days when you're trying to say, I cover Microsoft. I mean, they're not just operating systems and tools. They do ERP, they do CRM, they do the Xbox. I mean, there's just so many things you have to know a little bit about to be able to cover them.
Well, it's interesting because my concept about Microsoft today, which I certainly don't think was true when you got started, is that Microsoft is a lot of small companies with a common HR department. And sometimes they talk, sometimes they don't. But it's this sort of, you have these fiefdoms, and sometimes they're large fiefdoms like, the SQL Server Group, or small, fiefdoms like the who was I just thinking about yesterday. But that there's just these, there's a lot of people doing a lot of very interesting work. And, I think from the outside, we think of them as this, top-down perfect pyramid, and, one guy is orchestrating how everything works. And that's, when you talk to employees, that's, you just can't do that with whatever it is, their head count is now 110,000.
Yeah. And soon to grow even bigger once they acquire Nokia, right? They're going to be up to about 130,000.
130,000. Wow. Which is still, it's interesting that, for a company that produces as much as they do, their headcount actually isn't that big when you look at, the GMs, and you look at even HP. HP has a bigger headcount and, much smaller footprint.
Yeah. But it is. It's been, what's been interesting to me is covering them, like you say, at first it kind of felt like you were covering 7 or 8 different companies or more, right?
Yeah.
And it would be funny because sometimes you'd find out, me as the reporter, I'd find out something, say, Office was doing, right?
Right.
I go to the Windows team and I say, how are you going to work with this thing that Office is doing? And they're like, Office isn't doing that. I'm like, yeah, they are. And they'd be like, no, they're not. I'm like, go ask them. They are, Yeah. And it was kind of funny because it was like, I was the one telling them what their colleagues were doing. Right. But I feel like since Microsoft started changing a bit last year with this whole one Microsoft thing, that you can really already feel a difference. Like you can feel that the Windows team actually seems to know what the Windows Phone team is doing now, which is, believe it or not, it sounds like it should be common sense, but it's really different.
I'm totally with you.
Yeah. Like Office now seems to kind of know the Windows schedule. Wow. What a concept, right?
Yeah. That, you might want to release things, I don't know, in a similar time frame.
Right. I know. So I think that's going to change how we all end up covering Microsoft, because instead of covering a bunch of little fiefdoms, now you're going to be covering something that's more in sync with itself.
Sure. So, having you on the line, immediately kind of brings to mind, I wonder what your thoughts are about the new CEO, or, what I think is interesting is the fact that this is a CEO who wasn't around in '84, right? I mean,
right.
Both the other CEOs, were founder level, and how this, sort of changes the perspective there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what Nadella ends up doing and how he operates compared to how Bill and Steve used to operate. I got to I've interviewed Satya Nadella a few different times because he's been at Microsoft 22 years, and I've interviewed him in different jobs that he's had during that time. I most recently got to interview him in November when I was on campus doing a story about Steve Ballmer. And I had an hour with him, a sit down. I didn't know at the time he would be the CEO. I knew he was a candidate.
Sure.
And what I kind of took away from that interview was he had a lot of deep respect for Bill and Steve, and that he had been mentored quite heavily by Steve. Mm-hmm. And he talked a lot about the things Steve had taught him and lessons learned. So I don't think he's so much of like Steve did a terrible job and I'm going to do everything the opposite. I don't get that takeaway at all.
Sure.
I also feel like he was very on board with the whole One Microsoft idea, and that he wasn't into the thought of splitting up the company or selling off assets. That didn't come through at all. Especially because he used to be very key in running the Bing division. He's very committed to seeing that stay part of Microsoft. Sure. And not be spun off like some people on Wall Street want to see happen.
Yeah.
So I think his enterprise chops are going to be really good for Microsoft, because I almost feel like they've been getting away from their enterprise centricity a bit, which was a little concerning given who their user base is out there. So I think that's going to be really good. His cloud expertise, his enterprise software expertise, his knowledge about machine learning and Bing and how those things contribute into other products, not just Bing as a search engine. So I think he brings a lot of good things to the table.
For me, it's interesting because it feels like, a big change, but he's been there for so long that, in some ways I feel like it is going to be sort of the continued legacy. Certainly, I think the story of Bill stepping down and spending a third of his time, doing a lot of what he used to do is a bit much bigger story. I really kind of thought Bill would step aside completely and go, I have this foundation that's, fixing the world. Mm-hmm. I don't need to help with software anymore.
Yeah, I've written a couple of things saying I'm not sure how much that's reality versus a PR thing.
Sure.
Because I think Bill is really committed to running his foundation, and that seems like a full-time job. So he can say, I've freed up a third of my time for potentially helping out Satya if he needs it. But I think that almost is meant to appease people who don't think Satya is ready or that he needs help in some way. And not so much a reality as Satya really needs Bill to tell him what to do.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. So do you have a vision for, where you think you're going to go? Is this your beat from now on? Or, after 30 years, are you...
I ask myself this every day, pretty much. You know what? Every year I start out the year thinking I know what the year is going to be like, and every year it ends up different than what I thought. Like I've been doing a lot more speaking, and I've been doing a lot more podcasting through Windows Weekly and through shows like yours than I ever thought I would do. Because when I started out as a journalist, we were kind of meant to be read but not seen. Yep. That was kind of the way journalism worked. And now you have to be almost like a show person, right? Always entertaining and informing, right? Yeah. So I don't know what I'm going to do next. I like the job I have still, but you can never say what's going to happen. I don't think. I like covering Microsoft. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, but now that they're kind of on the wane, you're probably thinking about what's next." Well, I don't see them being on the wane during the rest of my career enough for me to say I'm dumping it. But I also am always open to seeing what's next. So I wish I knew more definitively, but I guess that's part of the fun of life. You don't really know.
You don't really know. And are there any companies out there that you think are going to be the Microsofts in 20 years that you've looked at? I'm not trying to give anyone, stock advice. It's just
no, which I'm not even allowed to do either.
Of course.
If people ask me a lot, especially younger journalists, who would I cover if I were starting out now? And I always say Amazon, just because they're such a weird company and very interesting. Like I like watching what they're doing on the cloud, but then there are all these other parts of their business that are so fascinating too. And Jeff Bezos is so strange, It's like I don't know. I think there would be a really fascinating company to cover right now.
Yeah, their purchase of the gaming company.
I know.
Yesterday, I think it was yesterday.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, then you really do want to be in everything, don't you, Jeff?
Yeah. I mean, if you cover Amazon, not only do you have to now know about gaming and cloud, you have to also know a lot about warehousing and retail, right? You have to know a whole set of
robotics
other things.
And newspapers.
Right. Drones.
Yes.
Rocket ships, space capsules. I don't know, so.
I think he gets distracted easily.
I think he does too. Yeah. But, they would be a really fun company to cover. Google, I still think would be very interesting to cover just because they're kind of all over the place. Mm-hmm. But I'm not that fascinated with the advertising business, and that's still so much of their business.
Yes.
That I don't think it would be as fun.
Yeah, because it just, as much as they seem to be trying to do this or that, they clearly are an ad business.
Yeah, they still are. I mean, whenever anybody says to me, they're really giving Microsoft a run for the money in the Office business, I'm like, not really, but okay. I mean, they've prompted Microsoft to do some things quicker, like bring Office to the cloud quicker. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that was because of Google, but to actually say revenue and profit wise that they're giving Microsoft a run in that space, no, they're not.
No. Yeah, it's the having competitors, is going to drive everybody, and the Office stuff from Google, just feels like Amy Pro all over again, right?
Yeah. Good analogy. Yeah.
There's always that one friend who was really passionate about it.
It's so true, right?
Everyone else was just going to try to get work done.
The other thing is a lot of people ask me about startups. I've had a couple of people say, you've got such a pedigree in technology now. Like, why don't you cover startups? That's where all the action is. And I have to admit, startups are interesting, but the reason I ended up loving to cover Microsoft was because how much influence they have in the world.
Yes.
And I don't know, covering a company that just does one kind of very tiny slice of what Microsoft does, it just to me isn't very interesting. Like if there's a day I'm bored in my job, I can say, okay, yesterday I wrote about ERP. Let's write about the Xbox today. Or let's write about, Visual Studio. I can go in all different directions, and there's so many things to keep you occupied and interested. But if you're covering, I'm going to pick on a couple, Dropbox or Evernote, it's like you have a very finite set of things that you can talk about and write about. And even if you cover everybody who's in their spaces, everybody who's in cloud storage, say, it's still pretty finite compared to what Microsoft does.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to kind of turn the direction a little, because this is sort of a selfish curiosity. Mm-hmm. I enjoy writing. It's sort of one of the things that's driven me to, articles and books and all that as part of what I do. And, no one writes books anymore, but you know what I mean.
Don't tell Paul Thurrott that. He still writes them for some strange reason.
Yeah, I get roped into one every 3 or 4 years now.
Do you? You're still doing them too, huh?
No, I keep on telling people I'm done this time. Really, really. At least done with, the actually doing a publishing. I did a little Kindle, 80 pager because I just had to write something. Mm-hmm. And, but as someone who has to produce something, I'm used to more longer form, or even if I'm doing an article, I do, maybe 10 articles a year at most. The amount of writing you have to produce, is this just, is it more because I've never been in sort of the journalism world that it feels very, impressive of putting out, 5 to 1,500 words, a day, or every, maybe 5,000 words a week. I don't know what the number is, but it's this sort of prolific level of writing that scares the heck out of me. Yeah,
I have to say I've kind of figured out over time the kinds of writing I like to do and the kinds I'm not that interested in. The 1 year I felt like I just couldn't do it and I was doing too many words was the year I ended up writing my book.
Oh, sure.
So I wrote a book about Microsoft in 2008 called Microsoft 2.0. Mm-hmm. And I had a year to write that. And so when that year I was working on that book, I felt like I never was off the writing clock. Like I do work in my regular day job, writing stories for the web and doing columns here and there and whatever else. And then at night and on the weekends, I'd work on the book. I was like dreaming every night about Microsoft, and I just felt like I could not, unplug. And that to me was just kind of like, whoa, I'm going to get really burnt out if I do this, you know? But the way my day is now, I don't have a set quota to write for anybody. I have things that I've committed to on some deadlines. But on my blog, I just write whenever there's news. So some days I write a lot of articles, like 4 or 5 blog posts. Some days I write 1, some days none. So I feel like the pace is good. I really love doing breaking news. That's kind of my thing now. Sure. And I don't really love doing long form anymore. I used to like it, but I don't find that interesting anymore. So I don't do a lot of that.
And people don't read anymore, so everyone reads
I always
the
think
headline
that,
and never gets through the long form. What do you mean?
I don't know. Some people still seem to like long form. I read a lot of long form stories, and I still find a lot of them very interesting and compelling. It's just not. I guess I've just lost my attention span, I would say.
Sure.
And I love that every morning when I start, it's a fresh start, and I don't have a long project hanging over my head.
I could certainly see that. When I do articles, I always think, oh, this is very exciting until the last week it's due. And then I'm like, what did I agree to? Was this a good idea? Yeah, I'm with you there. Well, it's been great having you on the show.
Yeah. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Interesting story. And, hearing the beginnings of your writing careers, I think will be of interest to most of our listeners. Try to keep dry in New York, and
I know. Yeah.
We'll keep on reading you.
Thanks. I appreciate it.